panelists you're going to hear from today are 5 remarkable women to add voices to those remarkable women and men that you've already heard from today. Before we begin our panel, I was sitting here remembering that 2 years ago, those of us from the U.S. came here in 2016, just days after a devastating election. And we were walking around in such a traumatized state. And you all brought us comfort and you all brought us hope, even though it was not easy for you as well. So many people have asked me here today, how are you all doing? It's been just about as bad as you envisioned, if not worse. And people have said, given the recent events in the U.S., what is happening? What is happening? And what I would say is we are fine, because what we just saw in the U.S. in the recent months was the last gasp of patriarchy. And systems like patriarchy fight the hardest when they are about to die. Today we have heard about liberation and freedom, love and justice, and most of all, spirit. When Davina was speaking this morning about freedom, I was reminded of an advocate in the U.S. named Sandy Barnett, who worked in a tough place in the U.S., a state called Kansas. And not long ago, Sandy said to me, you know what? She said, we no longer ask women who come into our shelter to tell us the details of the abuse that they have suffered. Instead, she said, we ask, what did you want to be when you were 9 years old? What were your dreams for yourself? Sandy was on the cutting edge of this new worldview that's been presented to you today. So this is what this panel is all about. This is the question we're going to answer. How do we take these big ideas and put them into practice? What are the transformative practices that will give women back those dreamed? And so you'll hear from our brilliant speakers one at a time. I've just broken something. I don't know what it is. So I'm going to start with Kit. Hi, Kit.
Hi, Lynn.
Give them a big round of applause. Kit Gruelle, you've been an advocate and a filmmaker, you've been a trainer, you've worked for decades both inside and outside of systems. You're a survivor, you've shared your story in hopes of making others feel less alone. And so there's so much I could ask you today, but I was recently struck by a Facebook post. So you posted a story, as you do, sadly, nearly every day, about a domestic violence murder that had occurred. In the U.S., 3 women a day are killed as a result of domestic violence by husbands, boyfriends, ex-husbands, ex-boyfriends. And that doesn't even count the toll that's taken through suicides and car accidents and other kinds of serious acts of violence. And so, Kit, you posted a story, Kit Gruelle, as you often do, and it was about yet another domestic violence murder. But you captioned it, "This is state-sanctioned homicide." This is state-sanctioned homicide. Tell us what you meant by that and what transformative practice means to you.
Well, unfortunately, Lynn's right. I do post almost every night stories about domestic violence, and I don't even want to use that term. I think we need to use the term malignant misogyny, because this is sort of the final fallout from this malignant misogyny. And when I post these stories, I read them because I'm interested in how the media covers them and what they say and if they accurately describe what happened. And what I'm struck by is that almost all of these women, and I refer to it as the E word, it was the estranged husband or the estranged boyfriend, which typically means that she had tried to access support and help as she made her way out of and beyond this abuse. And I live in a state, I live in North Carolina, where you get a 5-year sentence for kicking your dog and a 90-day sentence for kicking your wife. We have a charge that's used in North Carolina called misdemeanor assault with a deadly weapon, which means that a man can shoot or stab his wife or girlfriend, and unless it involves damage to a vital organ, it's going to get charged as a misdemeanor. So this is why I call it state-sanctioned violence. The abuser commits the act, and then the state drives the getaway car for him, and that's pretty much how it works out. And so for me as an advocate and someone who's been in our courts and working with women since 1986, and seeing how much has both changed and not changed, I find it frustrating that we made some pretty incredible progress for a period of time in the 90s, and then again when Obama was in office. And now we're faced with the most wretched and intense, I don't even have words for it. I literally don't have words for it. I can tell you as an advocate, because I still do direct service work primarily, what we're seeing in the United States, and there's a ripple effect of what's happening with Donald Trump. The scab has been ripped off, and people who feel that they have the right to abuse, harass, intimidate, coerce, anyone that they see as less than them, which I won't get into that exactly, but it's very, very, very difficult at this stage of the game to know that we made some pretty incredible progress, and now we're sort of back to really an even more desperate place than we were in when I first became an advocate. And I was kind of reminded of it the other day. I go out to a substance abuse treatment facility in Buncombe County last week. And we all think about doing this work on a grand scale, and we do need to do the work on a grand scale. We all need to be working together. This is a huge issue. It has multiple facets. But as I was going out, one of the social workers called, and she said, "We've got a woman who's in detox, and would you mind taking a few minutes to talk with her?" And I said, "No, it's fine." So I got done working with the women who were out of detox, and then went to speak with this young woman, and her hair was dyed bright turquoise blue. She had gotten herself into detox, which was a good thing. She's married to a very violent man, and lots of what all of us would consider very, very, very extreme abuse, really extreme abuse. She has permanent scars on the side of her neck where he strangled her with a belt repeatedly. She's never called the police about it because he broke her phone, so this is what her life has been like. But as we were talking, I said to her, "What, in your opinion, is the worst thing you've experienced?" And this is why it takes me back to what I think is the core of our work, which is listening to women. And she said what hurt her the most, and this is what made her cry. She had a son from her first marriage, and this second husband, who was so abusive, he got out the sonogram pictures of her pregnancy and burned them. And so I was interpreting her experience based on the physical abuse and the isolation and the terrorism and all this sort of thing, but the thing that kind of cut her in half was that he had destroyed the only pictures that she had of her baby when she was pregnant with him. And I was talking about it with Lynn on the way over, and one of the things that I have loved about being an advocate all these years is how much I get a chance to learn about dignity and grace and human strength and the human spirit. And I don't want to choke up, but I was so moved by her. I was so moved that she was able to articulate the deepest pain inside of herself, and then she knew that she needed to figure out some way to separate from him and ask for help. And so I think where we are now, at least in the US, at least in North Carolina, is we kind of have to do a back to the basics and remind ourselves, as we've created these big sort of systems responses, that really at the end of the day, it's kind of one-on-one with women who have been hurt and marginalized and terrorized, and that if we can listen to them with love and respect and help them understand that that they're not what they've been told they are, then I think that to me is what this work is about.
Thank you, Kit. And I should have said, you're going to, all of these women have so much to share with us, and we only have a few minutes with each. And so you heard from Kit about the centering and listening to women. And if you have questions for any of these panelists, we're taking questions through the Slido app, so please feel free to go ahead and start submitting them. And we're going to turn now, Kit, from what you've told us about the front lines to the corporate sector and how we see abuse addressed there. So Margot Slattery, you've been a leader in the corporate sector. You've worked on historic advocacy campaigns as well that have transformed Ireland. You've brought a gender framework to the workplace, and you've brought family-friendly policies to the corporate sector, so that you've done so much. What I want to know from you are what are the changes that you've seen, and what are the keys to the future? What's the momentum that will take us forward?
Okay, thank you. And I'm sort of standing on the shoulders of giants here. I'm beside somebody like Susie, who's been a great change maker in Ireland, and so many more. So I feel the corporate part is a lot lesser in many ways. But I think when you talk about the changes that we've seen and what are the transformations and the differences they'll make, I think, when I look back over, particularly in this country, and now I'm doing some of these things, or at least involved a bit more globally, but certainly, 20 years ago in business as a woman, in this country, you really didn't feel you had a voice. Mansplaining was a daily occurrence, and certainly your opportunity to rise up and to, I suppose, get to the next level in an organization was certainly very low. And the changes that we've seen, I think, is that that's radically improved. We have a long ways to go. We're just at a stage where we're looking at gender pay and equality, et cetera, and issues like that. But the areas for the future, I think, are certainly brighter than they were. And I mean, take many sort of scenarios. First of all, there are a lot more role models. So and again, I take this country as an example. You had some of them earlier on, people like Nora Casey and many others here today. We've got probably some of the top organisations in the world headquartered or having an EMEA headquarters in Ireland. And if you look at most of those organisations, they've got some fantastic women who are actually leading those organisations. And the pipeline for talent is pretty fantastic as well, coming up the ways. The work to be done is to continue to encourage and to support that, of course, because the challenge is that if it's not a daily conversation. Also, there's a little bit of, I think here, a little bit of sort of gender jadedness. People are getting a little bit tired of this conversation, and we need to make sure that there's that it's kept alive. I think other things for the future is when I see the young people that are coming through. So at the moment, even just a personal experience, I've got some nieces who are doing, they have a year from school where they get out and to look at business and industry and many other things, and they get a chance to be interns. And we've had I've had two of my nieces in, and I've had some friends' nieces and other people in our organization. God, they're amazing. I'm like, wow, if this is the next generation. When I look at the young people who join our organisation from college, and we employ about 4,000 people in Ireland, I look at the energy, the enthusiasm, the problem-solving ability that they have, and I think that's pretty fantastic. And then I think, obviously, I think, again, putting an Irish slant on it, the government's very engaged. I don't know if you've maybe seen, I know certainly the Minister for Children was here this morning, but Minister for Education, Minister for Higher Education, and many of the other government ministers. We might find faults in lots of things, but there are lots of positives as well. And they definitely want to get women into STEM and many other areas. There's investment in higher education around technology as well. And then I guess other areas just generally, for instance, again, going back to gender pay reporting, that sort of thing, we're going to do something about that's changing as well. So, the encouragement is there, the seeds are there, and then, of course, all of us need to make sure that we're pouring lots of water onto it.
Very good. Margot, you've given us a new term, gender jadedness, so now it's yet another thing to keep you all up at night, I just want to point out. Katrina Gleason, we'll move from sort of the corporate sector to policy. And Katrina, you've been leading Safe Ireland's policy for more than a decade. 2 years ago, you stood on this stage and you also shared your story in hopes of making other women feel less alone. You've helped pass groundbreaking legislation that we've been hearing about all day, and you've led awareness campaigns to expose the extent of violence that women and children are suffering in Ireland and all around the world. But in spite of all of this, in spite of all of these successes, you said something recently that I haven't been able to get out of my mind. And that is that you said, you know, that's all great, but it's 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards. 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards. Tell us what you meant by that and what's missing.
Well, when I said it, Lynn, I was thinking systems. And as I've thought about it since, I've thought about transformation. And as I finished the last panel, the last words I think I spoke were, change is deeply personal, and then it's everything else. And so when I think about 2 steps forward, 1 step back, I'm just going to bring you back a little bit to 2016. And we came out of here inspired. And I came out of here inspired. And then I met myself again, and the blocks in myself. And I was sitting at my desk the other day, and this word resilience, which we talk about an awful lot, kept flashing in front of me on the screen. And all I could see was resilience. And what I was seeing was, when you take out an I out of resilience, when you take out the individual, you resilience. And so I've been thinking about it, and 6th of October last year, I went home to my home county in Clare, back to the tribe, and shared space over 2 days with an incredible bunch of very powerful women and some men, mainly women, who gathered in a festival called Silence and Voice. And in that space, we found a way to articulate all that needs to be changed, that we were aware of. And in that space, I thought again about identity and my identity, but also the identity of those who are responsible for the abuse, for the rapes, for the murders, the identity of the men who raped me, the identity of the men who raped many women in the room. And in that space, I made a decision to, in my home county, name Billy Collins, the man who abused me for many years, and Paddy Coonan, a man who raped me, or attempted to rape me when I was in the farm, trying just to help take care of things. And in the energy of that, it was incredibly transformative, both for me, but also, as I heard back from people in the room, it activated something very deep in my home county. And also, it activated something in a collective consciousness, not because of my words, but because we were collectively gathering at the time as women around the world. And I spoke with Elaine not too long ago, who was coordinating Elaine Dalton, and she said to me, you spoke, you named the men, another man was named, and then I felt it just needed one more name and the whole thing was going to take off. And on the 8th of October, I was spending the day with my mother. It was her birthday. I was down in Ennis with her. And America woke up to the naming of the men. And we actively together reignited the Me Too movement that's been going for years. And this is the Resilience Piece. So the Resilience Piece is we haven't fully activated all of the awareness of all of those in the world who've been affected. We haven't identified, through all of the generations, all of those who are responsible for it. So today on the radio this morning, I was very aware that going on to live radio, I wasn't allowed to name that the person who murdered a woman yesterday might have been her partner, or any of that. Didn't get into that. But I'm very clear about the nervousness in the system, the nervousness, the fear of calling out those few men, not all men, but those few men
in the world who are responsible, who are destroying the reputation of all men, and the fear of calling that out, and the consequence then for the women on a daily basis that we're working with. So the other I go back to identity, is in the work that I'm doing on a daily basis, that I'm privileged to continue to be able to do. I get to listen and to hear the experiences of the women who are absolutely being tortured by the system that we're in, whose identity has been taken away from them. We knowingly, as a society, created an in-camera system in Ireland and in many places of the world, so we can keep the violence that's happening in the home in camera, supposedly to protect those women. But all we have done is created another layer of silence. There are women in this room today, there are women who want to be here who couldn't come, not because we didn't have room for them, but they couldn't come, whose children have been removed from them because of this system that is supporting these men who are going around as expert liars and who are feeding in and who are feeding in to a system that we are all a part of. So the 2 steps forward or back or up or down or wherever, it takes me back. I fell in love with a beautiful woman in just before 9/11, Maura, my wonderful partner, and it opened up for me how am I introducing my beautiful love to my family. And, society did its little trick at the time where this wasn't okay. So sitting in a pub with my dad and my brother, and my dad reared in Ireland in our wonderfully conservative, Christian-controlled, church-controlled, not Christian-controlled, but church-controlled country, a product of patriarchy, as much as I am, but in the male form. And Dad wouldn't have had much of an education, but he has a big heart. But he had no awareness of difference. And so he sat with my gay brother and I and talked about the faggots that he wanted to fuck off to bin Laden. And he talked about the English bastards. And he talked about all of the isms, all of the difference that he was terrified of. Little did he realize that many years later, in fact, I got back to Ennis again this year, and after quite a journey with my beautiful father, whose words in May this year, on the 26th of May when we voted, his very, very silent, nervous voice down the phone to me when I said, "I suppose you voted no then?" And he said, "No, I voted yes." And then he turned to me and he said, and because the week previous there was 2 women had been murdered, and he used many expletives to talk about the bastards that had done this to these women. And for me, this man thought I was going to be coming home in 1996 when I finished college to take care of him and my mum. This is what he understood women do. And for many years, he still doesn't understand why I haven't got a real job and what do I do and blah, blah, blah. And so here, suddenly, I'm on the phone and my beautiful father is telling me that he has voted for my daughters and for all of the women and girls in Ireland to help us have our bodily autonomy back. And a few weeks later, we get to Ennis and my brother is marrying his husband. And my father has struggled with this, but he found his heart and he got through all of his bigotry and his phobias, some of them, so it's a few left, but he'll be on the phone to me again tomorrow. And he showed up in his tuxedo with my brother who he nearly disinherited. And he showed up and he was the center of the wedding. He came back from the wedding and he told everyone, every neighbour, in the village in County Clare that voted 74% yes, he told every neighbour that he knew that it was the best wedding he'd ever been to. And so that's the seesaw. And so just to finish with time, the seesaw for me is we're making this incredible progress in Ireland, and yet we're going back. Progress and we're going back. And until we understand violence that's happening in the home and the silence that's attached to the home. And so what I haven't resolved yet is the silence in my family attached to the abuse of me, and I'm fairly confident others in my family, has not yet been resolved in our systemic family system. I am well, and I understand that I am free, but I understand that others aren't, and for as long as everybody isn't free, we are all affected. And so I suppose just to finish, I do have hope, but I also don't want Ireland to go out into the world and say, yes, we are the most amazing country in the world for social change, when we haven't looked really to the most closest space, which is the intimacy of relationship and family and the violence that's alive. And so in the meantime, we have failed another woman yesterday. In the meantime, another child, 2 children, a 16-year-old, met his Auschwitz yesterday when he walked in and found his mother dead. And so this is why we need to raise this up. And I don't have the answers yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina. As always, you've linked personal transformation with global transformation, and we're going to go deeper now with you, Susie Byrne. Your work on disability rights here in Ireland has been groundbreaking, and it's influenced the entire world. You've made it your mission to help people understand the barriers and challenges that survivors of abuse who also have disabilities face, that additional layer that people experience. You've brought attention to what is often a hidden community when we talk about violence and abuse, where we don't always see what we need to be seeing. So tell us, how can we transform Ireland, indeed the world, for survivors with disabilities?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I have to say, this is a very able space. In terms of there have not been many voices, or there aren't many people with visible disabilities, and indeed there will be people here with hidden disabilities here. But even in the debates, in the organisations, in the feminist movement in Ireland, the voices of women with disabilities have very much been hidden. The story and the discussions of violence within the disability community are still very much hidden. And we come from a situation in Ireland where we have decades of disclosure of Magdalene survivors, of institutional abuse, of the Ryan report, which documented in a chapter the experiences of people with disabilities in institutions. Today, while I've been sitting at the back of the room, I've been looking at this slogan here of making Ireland the safest country in the world. And I've been thinking about the policy now and the transformations that are needed in order to support people with disabilities to be really safe. And I think people think we're doing that. Because at the moment, you'll hear an ad on the radio about safeguarding. Don't abuse the disabled or the vulnerable person in your household. We have safeguarding committees. We have social workers. We have teams. We have loads of things in place to talk about safeguarding. What we don't have are the things to stop things happening in the first place. We have set up systems where people with disabilities are trapped within their family home, which exposes them more to the chance of violence. We have carers' allowances. We have hundreds of thousands of people involved in family care, which increases the chance and the risk of people being exposed to violence and abuse. because everybody thinks everybody's okay. And the only images of people with disabilities that we see rarely are the successes, the inspiration porn, as I've called it, and other people have named it, which are the successes, and aren't they great, or the tragedies. And we don't see people in the middle. And I think the transformation I want to call for really is that everybody with a disability is offered what Marcia talked about this morning, which was the things that women look for when they're trying to escape violence or situations. And what people with disabilities are looking for is equality. They're looking for a home, a life, a job, food on the table, those sort of things. And to have that, a decision themselves in that, and not to be spoken for all the time, either by government or the state, or the organisations that have been set up to represent us but don't include our voices and the structures that are there, or our families who think and many want to do their best for us, but are faced in a situation where they are the only people there to care for us because nobody else wants to take those decisions anymore. And all of these factors coming together increase the risk of violence, abuse, neglect, silencing of people with disabilities. And I think that if we really want to see equality and not to have the inspiration only or the tragedy case, we have to remove the charity model, which has sadly through austerity come back in. And we need to stand with every disabled person and say, what do you want in your life and how can we help you get it? What truly is equality? It's not just about a pilot project or a few token employees in a company who have a disability, or the people who get to college and then who I meet at the end of college realise they have a disability because every support they've had up to getting to college disappears again. We need to see that disability is for life, that supports that are needed for disabled people are for their lives, and that they should be able to turn to people to seek help and not feel beholden to people for equality, for access, for all of those things. And then together with that in-camera process I want to talk about, I want also to think that when people are affected, are hurt, are seeking justice, that they are heard and listened to as well. Because one of the things, and the thing that got me, I suppose, speaking about survivor issues with disability, is the fact that so many disabled people, when they do disclose, are not believed or are not listened to because the justice system says, no, you can't, we won't be able to take your evidence or hear from you because your capacity. They challenge people's capacity all the time. And so many people get away with things. And as witnesses, they are not supported. And we need to change laws around that. So there's a lot going on there, I know.
Susie, you've given us so much: equality, home, life, job, listening to the people most affected by violence, not the charity model, but the model of liberation and freedom. And so to close us out, we're going to turn to Kiki. We need you to take us into the future. You've worked with youth in the US and here in Ireland. For 7 years, you've focused on gender-based violence and most recently on consent education. You, more than anyone in this room, understand that a generational shift is taking place around the world. Tell us what that shift means to ending gender-based violence and making Ireland and the world safe and equal again. It's a big charge for you,
Yeah,
Kiki.
I'll just lead us into the future right now. Get ready. There are generational shifts happening, and I think that's very important to talk about today, and especially important when we have a real diversity of ages in the room today, and I think that's also important to kind of show. One of the reasons why I'm here today is because I tried to help organize 85 young people, 16 through 25, to attend this event over the 2 days. And I would like to ask, I know some people had to leave early for school and college and all that, but for those who are here with us today that are young people, can you all stand up, please? Please.
Woo! Yeah.
Thanks. Sorry, I didn't want to embarrass you, but I also wanted you to get your moment. Yeah, so, and in terms of what the young people have been speaking with me about recently is that, young people and all people as well have more information on their fingertips now than we probably ever had before. And, there's more opportunities to get your voice heard and to connect with other people than there perhaps have been, especially, Twitter and online activism and all of that. And so through that, and through people having access in ways they haven't before, we've seen people spread their stories and stand up and speak out to a wider audience, in the likes of Me Too, Time's Up, and locally in Ireland, Northern Ireland, I Believe Her, in reaction to the Patty Jackson trial. But the shifts that are happening, I don't think, they're a lot more than just the new voices and the survivors that we're hearing from, which are obviously integral and very important. But there's a lot more that I feel like that's brought up and a lot more coming into the fore, because it's unearthed a lot of trauma, but it's also unearthed a lot of internalized judgments. And we're able to kind of watch in real time all of those internalized judgments and patriarchal responses to people's trauma. So we've seen a lot of unearthed oppressive views as well. And for a lot of people, especially myself, it showed me what I already anecdotally knew, with research as well, but what I already anecdotally knew, which is that it's hard for me to think of a friend or a family member or a person that I know that hasn't been raped or that wasn't abused as a child or in a relationship later in life. It's a struggle for me to find. That's more of a rarity for me to think of someone that hasn't been touched by that in some way than it is. It's more of a commonality for me to think of than it is a rarity. And we often talk about it as a tokenism or as a rare thing. Maybe not in this room, but in greater society. So all those movements, we've seen a real reckoning that's been going on. And it's not just a reckoning for survivors, although it definitely is that, but I think it's also a reckoning that's pointing to gaps in our inclusion and the gaps that these conversations have. This is definitely a pattern in activism that we've seen, not to make it too American-centric, but in the 1920s with women's suffrage in the US, black women said, you must make us a part of this movement, like we need to be here, and they were sidelined. The civil rights, the call for civil rights justice, was sidelined to kind of push forth women's suffrage at that time, and we see that a lot. We see other issues being sidelined so that we can just try to push forward to make it simpler, to get people on board with a particular message. And I think people are done with that. I think people are done with this one issue, one view, easy, tie it up with a bow activism. I think the reckoning is also kind of asking us all to clean house. And that's clean house in our activism, clean house in our organizations, but clean house in ourselves. And just looking at what we're leaving out. And when I look at it, I feel like we're leaving out a lot, because still, even now, all the narratives that we mostly hear about are middle-class, white, majority heterosexual, cis women. When we think about the classic abuse survivor, that's what we hear. And those are experiences, those are my experiences, those are people's experiences. They're not any better or worse than anyone else's, but that's just one part of the picture. Trans people are mostly left out of this conversation. Non-binary people are mostly left out of this conversation. A lot of people don't have the language to speak about it sensitively. They would maybe want to, but they don't even know where to begin with that. That education piece is missing for them. Black people's narratives and people of color, their narratives are not being centered in these arguments. And I'm not just pulling this out of my hat, this is what we hear from them, so we should be listening. That's what we're hearing from them over and over again. And also just the ways that we're having these conversations, how grassroots are they? Are they mostly centered in academia or in a language that other people maybe don't have access to? So I'm trying to bring it back to what I feel like is the transformation. So all of these issues, and we've talked about it a lot today, are, they're speaking to a dominator culture, and dominator culture is another way of talking about abusive culture, where some people have the power and others don't. And I really loved Davina saying earlier that, our culture, it can equal an abuser's handbook, because it oftentimes feels that way. And for me, the transformation is to look at the root causes, and that's not a new paradigm. We're always talking about primary prevention, but what are the root causes? And for me, in my limited picture in the work that I do, like it's the strict bifurcation of society across gendered lines. The only way that we really talk about gender is that, you know, a baby is born and we look at their genitalia and that will decide almost every part of their life going forward. And there's just no need for that. And we also talk about that there's only 2 types of bodies being born in the world, and that's also not true, because 1 in every 1,500 births aren't XX or XY chromosomes. So the fact that there are only men and women in the world just isn't true. Whether your opinions are differing otherwise, the fact of the matter is there's not just men and women. There's not just these 2 categories. And more young people today are voicing that they don't want to be bifurcated in those 2 boxes. So we can expand the idea of what the boxes mean, but when the boxes are still there and they're not even true categories, we see more people fighting against that. I know I'm over time, but trying to pull it back to my work. So I started in work that was basically looking at toxic masculinity and how we can, how men can, look at their toxic masculinity and move towards a healthy masculinity framework. And now in my work with Spun Out.ie, I give workshops on a wide breadth of issues that we cover, but the ones topical for today are consent education, gender and sexuality, and bullying, which is really what we're talking about at the end of the day. And those workshops are that education piece is so important, and it's transformative, and we need it, but in a lot of ways it's too late, because we think of it as primary prevention, but it's not really, when those people coming to those workshops are still born a certain way, raised a certain way, and socialized in a certain way. So then they have to go through the work of unlearning these things a bit later, which is still what we need to do. That's still the transformative work. But the transformative work for me is getting to the point where we don't even need them, where we're just raised as human beings and as people without these boxes.
Whoa! I don't know what they want me to do. So you did it. You brought us into the future with a reckoning for inclusion, intersectionality, although I don't think you used the term, but you described the paradigm. You took us beyond the gender binary, and you took us into the future. So thank you for that. And questions? No? So your questions will not go unanswered. That will happen at some point. But today we will end as we began, with freedom and liberation, with love and justice and spirit. Thank you all so very much. Thank you all, my brilliant panelists.